So the objective for this lesson is to define imperialism, to be able to list the causes of imperialism in the late 1800s, early 1900s for America, and also be able to describe the results of American imperialism. Now, this right here is just a straight textbook definition of imperialism, the policy in which stronger nations extend their economic, political, or military control over weaker territories. This is going to lead to a global competition. In the early 1900s, imperialism had become so popular with the higher developed countries that only 2 countries in Africa had not been colonized. So imperialism can be done a few ways. You can colonize a particular territory. So if you think about America and Britain, Britain came over and colonized the New World and set up those colonies. That is a form of imperialism. You can also have what's known as a sphere of influence, where you don't necessarily control the government, but through money and trade, you control what happens in that particular area. This would happen a lot in East Asia. You also have what is known as a protectorate, where the weaker nation still keeps its government, but it's pretty much led by the stronger country, by strings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about imperialism. But late 1800s, early 1900s, countries like Spain, America, England, France were all colonizing or participating in this act of imperialism of a stronger nation taking over a weaker nation. There were a number of causes for imperialism in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The first was a desire for military strength. Imperialism is going to lead to this competition among these large nations in the world. And you need to remember this because this is going to play a huge role in the start of World War I. But the first thing I want to talk about is the desire for military strength. Spain and England have been creating a huge global military presence. They were the big players, especially when it came to their navies. A man named Alfred Mahan, who was a Navy admiral, wrote a book entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. This was published in 1890. And he believed that by building up the Navy, this would truly be what made America strong. Because of his writings, America built battleships and cruisers and became the 3rd largest navy in the world. It became known as the Great White Fleet. The second cause of imperialism, again, stronger nations going out and taking over these smaller nations, is this thirst for new markets and raw materials. Countries like America, England, they were going through these industrial revolutions where they had these factories that were creating all of these products, and they wanted to be able to sell it to more than just Americans, because if you sell more of your product, you make more money. So if you take over a particular area, a smaller country, you can force them to buy your products. So that could be a reason. Also, it costs money for raw materials like oil or silk or something that is expensive and you don't have in your native country. So you might go to a smaller country and take over that country so you can control the cost of that. The third cause of imperialism is going to be belief in cultural superiority. Some people believed in imperialism for power, and that's what the main reasons are going to be. But some people actually believe imperialism as they saw it in doing good for others. And it could be what am I trying to say? They acted like it was a really good thing, but really they were not giving these people a lot of credit for what they were doing. So we talk about social Darwinism. We talked about social Darwinism in the Gilded Age, where we talk about survival of the fittest. And some of these people say, well, we're culturally superior to these people, so we might as well just go take them over because they're not going to survive anyway. They are not the fittest. We are the fittest. If they were the fittest, they would have survived. They would have had their own industrial revolution. But no, we're going to come in and we're going to take over. part of that cultural superiority, or this spread of Christianity. It is our duty to bring Christianity to these people. They are a backwards people. They are savages. They are tribal. They have zero civilization. And by us going, we are going to bring that to them and make their lives better. Another reason of the part of this culture superiority is to bring them democracy, where many Americans saw this as the greatest, one of the greatest gifts they could give these people. But if we're thinking about the spreading of cultural superiority, it had a huge impact, especially on Africa. When you talk about bringing American culture into Africa, a lot of traditional African culture was lost because of this belief in cultural superiority. But those are the three reasons or causes for imperialism: desire for military strength. And they were able to do these things because of this growth in technology, especially weapons. These smaller countries did not have the advanced weaponry that the larger countries had. So when they went to go take over a country, they easily did it. And also medications, treatments for things like malaria, where it made it a little bit safer to go into these underdeveloped countries. So let's think about it a minute. You can pause the video, think about these questions, because these are really things that you're going to have to be able to answer in order to become proficient in imperialism. So I said the objective was that you had to define imperialism. So what exactly is imperialism? What were the major factors that contributed to the growth of American imperialism? And this is a thinking question. Do you think America is an imperialistic nation today? Why or why not? So you may want to pause the video, reflect on those questions, take some notes on those questions. So now that we've talked about imperialism, let's delve into a little bit deeper by looking at a primary source. Please remember, imperialism, a larger country taking over a smaller country, and causes of imperialism included wanting more military strength by increasing the size of the military, creating global competition, desire for new markets, desire for raw materials, and also that cultural superiority piece. So let's look at one Indiana senator's reason for imperialism. In the following passage, how does Indiana Senator Beveridge explain the need for the U.S. to acquire means to take or get, new territory? So remember, a primary source is something from that time period, like a diary, a journal, a photograph, as opposed to a secondary source, which is something where you look at primary sources and you write about them. So kind of like your textbook, for example. So in the following passage, how does Indiana Senator Beveridge explain the need for the U.S. to acquire new territories? Let's read this together. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. We will establish trading posts throughout the world as distributing points for American products. Great colonies governing themselves, flying our flag, and trading with us will grow about our post of trade. So when I'm looking at this, the first thing I want to do when looking at primary source, what do I see? What do I see that's familiar to me, since especially I've already learned about imperialism? If you want to pause the video for a second and just kind of read it again and try to look through it on your own and pull some things out. But the first thing that I want to look at is I notice that there's the repetition of a particular word. What word do you see in here that is repeated a lot? When I look, I see the word trade. I see trade. I see trading post. I see distributing, which is a form of trade. I see trading here, trade here. So when I'm thinking of the causes of imperialism and the desire for markets and raw materials, and I'm reading this sentence by Beveridge, fate has written our policy, the trade of the world must and shall be ours. We will establish trading posts throughout the world. So if I look right here, I would see this would be his reason for imperialism. This is the real reason he is going to be pushing for imperialism, those economic factors, especially trade. Imperialism and the results of imperialism will reach the nation of Cuba, which is just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Cuba was a colony or a protectorate, or it belonged to the Spanish. The Spanish at the time were ruling Cuba. American capitalists, those are people that invest their money to make money, they began investing millions of dollars in sugarcane plantations in Cuba, and they liked making money in Cuba. But there were some problems that were going on. In 1895, a Cuban named Jose Marti started to lead a revolution against Spanish rule in Cuba. Now you think, well, what does that have to do with America? If we're going back to economic factors for causes of imperialism, it's going to disrupt that sugar cane plantation. And I left an E off right there. An E should be right there. It's going to disrupt that sugar cane plantation production. In the process of a revolution, it is war. So plantations were burned, causing distress for these American businessmen who had invested millions of dollars. But at the time, American opinion was split. Some thought America should get involved, some thought that they shouldn't. In order to end this Cuban revolution, the Spanish sent in a general by the name of Weyler. Now, Weyler was sent in to bring order back to Cuba and put down the revolution. But he did it in ways that would really upset not just the Cuban population, but also the American population as well when they would see stories of it. Weyler, when he got to Cuba, he faced guerrilla war fighting from the Cubans. This is when people use their surroundings to help them fight. A lot of ambushes, those kind of things. So, and in guerrilla warfare, it's hard to tell who's loyal and who's not to Spain. In order to do that, he rounded up rebels that were loyal to the Cuban cause and put them in relocation camps. But these were actually concentration camps. And he in total would round up about 300,000 Cubans and put them in these, quote, relocation camps. But when they were put in these camps, he didn't provide them with the things they needed. And so many of them starved to death or died of disease. Thousands of people would die in these camps. Now, anytime you have travesty or disaster or craziness happening, the media, even in 1895, is going to pick up on it. So, American journalists got wind of what was going on with Weyler, and it's going to fuel a war over newspaper sales, particularly between two people, William Randolph Hearst. He was the editor of the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. These two men are competing to sell the most newspapers, and they saw the revolution in Cuba, the actions of Weyler, as an opportunity to sell newspapers. What they would do is they would get newspaper stories, exaggerate them in order to sell them. They would use words like Weyler the butcher. They would do untrue stories that Weyler would poison the well, or there was even a story reported that Weyler threw children to sharks. None of these are true, but it sold newspapers. Think today of all the things on the internet that catch your attention really, really quick. And it's not necessarily because later you find out, oh, that wasn't even true, but something caught your attention. This is called yellow journalism. Now, this is a key term that you need to know. Yellow journalism, right here. You have to know what this is. This is going to be a huge cause of the Spanish-American War. It is a sensational style, this exaggerated style of writing, which exaggerates the news to lure and enrage readers. They become emotionally charged, emotionally invested in the story they are reading, and it may not even be true what they are reading. There's one account from yellow journalism during the Spanish-American War where an artist was sent down to go draw pictures of what was going on, and he brought the pictures back to the editor. He's like, nothing's going on really, it's pretty calm. And the editor said, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war. And that's what's going to happen. These newspaper editors really fuel the fire for support for this war. Here you will see some examples of that yellow journalism. You might want to just take a minute and look at them and just kind of see exactly what that yellow journalism looked like. Now, you not only have this revolution in Cuba going on, you have American businessmen upset because their sugar plantations are being burned. You have the journalist using this yellow journalism to spread these emotionally charged stories about what's going on in Cuba. But there are even more events that bring America on the edge of war and even to war. The first is the DeLome letter, which is going to be written by the Spanish minister to the U.S. So a Spanish man living in the U.S. is going to write a private letter. And the president at the time was President McKinley. And in this letter, he criticizes President McKinley. This is in February 9th, 1898, when that letter is published on February 9th, 1898. This letter is found, it's published, and America starts, it's just a little bit more of the teeter-totter effect of falling towards this hatred of Spain. Remember, you already have a war going on in Spain, but it's between the Cubans and the Spanish. I mean, a war already going on in Cuba. I'm sorry, not Spain. And it's between the Cubans and the Spanish. Americans are teeter-tottering on whether or not they should get involved. So you have the yellow journalism, you have the economic interest, now the DeLome letter. Now, the straw that really breaks the camel's back is going to be the sinking of the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine is an American ship. Early 1898, McKinley ordered the Maine to bring home Americans in danger of Cuba. So you have the Maine there in Cuba that is there to bring Americans back home to America so that they are not in danger of this revolution that is occurring. On February 15th, 1898, the ship blows up in Havana Harbor. When this ship blows up, 260 men are killed. American newspapers immediately go to press or print that it is the Spanish fault. The warship Maine was split in two by an enemy's secret infernal machine. This infernal machine many thought to be a mine placed by the Spanish. Now, the Spanish vehemently denied their involvement in the explosion of the USS Maine. But it was too late. The newspapers had already been printed. Americans truly believed, that the Spanish were the ones that exploded the Maine. And the rallying cry became, "Remember the Maine." You're never going to find Americans more willing to go to a cause than if Americans have been killed. And so after February 15th, 1898, you have this almost total support for a war in Cuba against the Spanish. So America is going to go to war to defeat the Spanish. Here you have an artist's rendition of the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine definitely did explode. That is true. 260 men did die. But I want you to look at this picture and really see maybe some sensationalist things that you see here that may not have actually that may have been added to fuel the emotion. You might want to pause it, think about it a second. The number one thing that stands out to me in this artist rendition of the sinking of the Maine is this right here. These bodies just flying up in the air, and this is just going to emotionally enrage American people when they see it. So the USS Maine, it explodes on February 15th, 1898. On April 20th, President McKinley will declare war on the Spanish. With the declaration of war on April 20th, you have what is known as the Teller Amendment. Now, this is an agreement that when America goes to war with Spain in Cuba, that the U.S. could not annex Cuba. That means that when the war is over, America cannot take Cuba for its own. They're not just going to supplant the Spanish power. So they're not going to say, okay, the Spanish are out now. America is in control. They're going to leave control of the island to its people. Now, this right here I want you to pay very close attention to, because this is going to come up again when we talk about the end of the war. They want to leave control of the island to its people, the Cuban people. The first battle is actually not even fought in Cuba. It's fought in the Philippines, which is another Spanish-controlled territory. America will win this. And they will, now because the Philippines was not part of the Teller Amendment, they say, forget you Filipinos, and we are going to annex you. We are going to take you as our territory. 125,000 Americans will volunteer for this war in Cuba. The most famous group of fighters that you will see pictured here are the Rough Riders. Now, this group of people, the most famous person in this group right here is in the center, and that is Teddy Roosevelt. You see him right here. He is going to be the leader of the Rough Riders and will lead them up San Juan Hill. This is a very short war, a 10-week war. Happens very quickly. America is in, defeats the Spanish, they're out. 2,910 Americans will die in the Spanish-American War. Of that 2,910, 2,565 will die from disease. So let me, just to show you those numbers again. So you have 2,910 die total Americans. 2,565 of that 2,910 actually die from disease. So not that many people actually die fighting in the war. Most of them die from disease. They get down there and they're exposed to things like malaria, and they can't recover from them. The treaty to end the Spanish-American War, which ends on August 12th, 1898, again a 10-week war, was the Treaty of Paris. Spain freed Cuba, and Spain also gave Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States as part of this treaty. It'll also be the Philippines as well. Now, because Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines are not part of the Teller Amendment, America can annex those. But Cuba was specifically mentioned in the Teller Agreement, so it cannot be annexed. So real quick, I want to talk about Puerto Rico before we move on. During the war and shortly after, it was under military rule until 1900, when you have the Foraker Act, and it ended military rule and set up a civil government. To this day, Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States government. And before I forget, I do want to mention, this is very important that you know this, that in 1976, there was an investigation of the USS Maine and the explosion of the USS Maine. Historians wanted to find out, was it really the Spanish that exploded the Maine? And according to this investigation in 1976, it was likely an internal fire. That means it happened from within the ship. So it was not a Spanish mine that blew up the USS Maine. So in 1901, so the war ended in 1898. So a couple years later, 3 years later, you have the passage of the Platt Amendment. Now, the Platt Amendment was the process of removal of American troops from Cuba. Because remember, America could not annex Cuba. Okay, so troops have to be removed. So I want you to take a minute, pause, and read over some of these articles or parts of the Platt Amendment. And we're going to do a little activity with it in just a second. So pause it and read over those. I just don't want to read them to you. So when you look at the Platt Amendment, I have Cuba could not make treaties that might limit its independence. The United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuba. Cuba was not to go in debt. And the United States could buy or lease land. So America would not remove troops until the nation of Cuba agreed to these things as part of the Platt Amendment. All of these things are going to be added to the Platt Amendment Americans would say, in order to protect Cuba, but you're going to have some American advantage in this Platt Amendment as well. So what I want to do is look at these 4 parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 parts, and really see what those advantages for the United States are. So the first one, Cuba could not make treaties that might limit its independence. So they would see this, and if you're thinking of the causes of causes of imperialism, you would think of that spreading of democracy. They want to keep democracy. Now, a democratic nation 90 miles away is much better for the United States. They have open trade. America can trade with them. And it's easier to work with a democratic country than a country that puts the thumb down on its people. If you think about Cuba today, it is not a democratic country. It is a communist country, and trade embargoes have been put on, and the relationship with Cuba has not been as easy. Let's look at the next one. The United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuba. Think about this for a second. Pause the video. How is this an advantage to the United States? When you think about continuing that idea of democracy, it keeps America in charge of who is in charge. America gets to decide who is in charge. If they think that there is a group of people that is gaining too much power because of this, they believe they have the right to intervene, and they can come into Cuba and put things into order the way they want. The third one, pause and think again. Cuba was not to go into debt. Now, debt is when you owe money. What would be an advantage to the United States of Cuba not being in debt? Well, if they're in debt to another country, that country has power over them. Anytime, even today, something simple, if you owe your sister, if you owe your brother, if you owe your grandma money, they have a power over you until you pay that money back. And America did not want to give up any of their influence over Cuba. And so by going into debt, one, it creates an unstable country that may not have the trade capacity that America wants it to have. But then they may have to answer to other countries. May have to answer to other countries. And guys, sorry, my stylus is really bad. Okay. The United States could buy or lease land. This is the last thing we're going to look at. How is this an advantage to the United States? Pause and think. This one is super simple. They could continue their business in Cuba. And if you control land, you control people. So I don't mean by slaves. That's not what I mean. But land is power, especially if you're talking about sugar plantations. So America could still come in, buy land. You're thinking of going into a country that's just been through a war. They probably don't have a lot of money. Land has been destroyed. They can buy it for cheap. And so you have American businessmen who are going to own a lot of land, maybe opposed to actual Cubans. I want you just to reflect and think about as we go through the next few things about imperialism. And I want you to think about these questions. Pause it, think about it, because these are going to be questions that you really need to reflect on and understand in order to master proficiency on imperialism. 1, how did the Spanish react to the uprising in Cuba? What factors helped to arouse American feelings of animosity towards Spain? Where was the Spanish-American War fought? And what were the results of that war? Now remember, we said in the Teller Amendment that Cuba could not be annexed, but that did not mention Guam. It did not mention Puerto Rico, which we talked about. Puerto Rico was taken care of with the Forker Act and allowed them to set up a civil government but remained United States territory. But you also have the Philippines, where the first battle of the Spanish-American War was fought, and America took over and annexed the Philippines. And the Filipinos were upset that the Treaty of Paris allowed for the annexation of the Philippines. They're thinking, what? What do you mean? You're just going to replace the Spanish and rule like they did? So in February 1899, you have a revolt against American rule in the Philippines. They are going to use guerrilla war tactics. There will be 3 years of fighting. 20,000 rebels died. This is cost more. More Americans will die in this rebellion than you had in the actual Spanish-American War. 4,000 Americans died, and it would cost the American government $400 million. As America moves into being this imperialist nation, you have America divides into two groups. You have the interventionists. Think of someone who wants to intervene, someone who wants to get involved, and the non-interventionists. They are the opposite. They do not think America should intervene. So the interventionist is going to be for imperialism, and the non-interventionist is going to be against imperialism. So when you think back to that first primary source, we looked at Beveridge, the senator from Indiana, where he talked about trade. He was an interventionist. He supported imperialism. Remember, we looked at his quote, and it was for trade reasons, those economic factors. Another interventionist that we talked about is Mahan, who wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, the building of that military and the strength. They truly believe that America should be one of these imperial powers and intervene in these different countries. Non-interventionists were against the imperial actions of America. They eventually created the Anti-Imperialist League. They felt it was wrong for America to rule other people without their consent. Famous Americans who were members of this Anti-Imperialistic League were Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams, the founder of the Hull House, and Mark Twain, who you see his picture right here. Mark Twain's the one, a famous American author, also coined the term the Gilded Age. Here is a quote from Mark Twain. "Shall we go on conferring our civilization among the peoples that sit in darkness, or shall we give those poor things a rest? Extending the blessings of civilization to our brother who sits in darkness has been a good trade and has paid well on the whole. And there is money in it yet, but not enough, in my judgment, to make considerable risk advisable." He says, yes, you can make money. You can increase trade, but is it worth the loss of hurting these people, the risk that is involved? Now, in this quote specifically, Mark Twain is talking about the Philippines and the action of America in the Philippines. So right here, he's specifically referencing the Philippines. So again, interventionist for imperialism, non-interventionist against imperialism. So here's some more reflection questions for you to pause and think about in order for you to reach proficiency. What was the significance of the Foraker Act? What did the Platt Amendment state? Why do you think the U.S. wanted to attain a strong influence in Cuba? What was the result of the Philippine-American War? Now, I know I didn't mention earlier, but America will stay in the Philippines for some time after that. So this is our last slide. I know this has been a long one. There's a lot to it. I want to look at some different presidential approaches to imperialism, specifically that of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt will become president. And we'll talk a lot more about Teddy Roosevelt when we talk about progressivism, but I definitely want to talk about him here when it comes to imperialism because he plays a large role in it as well. Teddy Roosevelt is going to make it his mission to really get Panama Canal in American territory. I'd really like for you, if you can, when this is over, to look up the Panama Canal on a map and see where it is. It's in Central America, that kind of isthmus that connects North America and South America. A canal is a series of water elevators that allow a ship to move across land. Prior to the construction of the Panama Canal, if a ship wanted to go from the east coast of America to the west coast of America, they had to sail all the way south of South America. This was a very dangerous journey and a very lengthy journey. So a canal would shorten that distance considerably. So in 1903, when Teddy Roosevelt was elected president, he makes this one of his goals to finish the Panama Canal. Now, the Panama Canal was already under construction. It actually started in 1881. The French were in control of this construction. But it was very poorly planned. They didn't really have a game plan. When the French went over, 22,000 workers, Panamanians, French, died from either accident or disease. So by 1894, just 3 years later, they quit. They stopped the process of building this canal. So Roosevelt comes in. He wants this quick water path from the east to west coast. There was some unrest in Panama against the Colombians. So America supported a Panamanian revolution. Now, they didn't actually fight. They just put their muscle behind it. They said we would support it if it happened. In exchange, America was granted the canal zone. So Panama, who were facing this outside pressure from Colombia, because America said they would be willing to support, they said, okay, if you're willing to support, we will give you control of the canal. U.S. assumed control of the canal, or assumed control of construction of the canal in 1904, and it would last until 1914, until the canal was finally completed. In the process of the building of the Panama Canal, 5,600 Americans would die. Fun facts about the Panama Canal today, because it is still used today. Now, when Jimmy Carter was president, the Panama Canal was, and this was in the 70s, was turned back over to the Panamanians. So America had control of the Panama Canal well into the 1900s. 13 to 14,000 ships today, every day, use the canal. This is today. Each year, 13 to 14,000 ships. Average, it takes about 8 to 10 hours to pass through this canal. The toll, or the price you have to pay to go through the canal, the smallest toll ever paid was 36 cents in 1928 by an American named Richard Halliburton, and he swam the canal. Today, the largest ships pay about $450,000. Annually, the Panamanians collect about $1.8 billion in toll fees. Complete control was transferred in 1999, but America does have the right to protect it, because America does use this canal a lot for shipping reasons, and if someone goes to attack the canal that the Panamanians can't stop, America has the right to step in. So Panama Canal, huge move for Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is also going to be associated with big stick diplomacy. You need to be familiar with this policy. He determined to make the U.S. the dominant power in the Caribbean and in Central America. He wanted America to be the powerhouse in the Western Hemisphere. He adds what is known as the Roosevelt corollary. Now, a corollary is a proposition that follows from one already proved. So what is the one already proved? Well, that would be the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823, further efforts by European nations to colonize land or interfere with states in the North and South America would be viewed as acts of aggression, requiring U.S. intervention. So the Monroe Doctrine 1823 says if any European country comes over to North or South America, we're going to see it as an act of aggression and America can intervene. Well, Roosevelt adds on to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 with the Roosevelt corollary, specifically speaking of Latin America. And for some reason my highlighter is not working. Maybe I need to pick a color. Disorder in Latin America might force the U.S. to exercise an international police power. So if there is disruption within Latin America, not even someone coming into Latin America, but there's revolution in Latin America, there is civil war in Latin America, if there's any type of unrest or disorder, according to the Roosevelt corollary, America can act as this big policeman with his big stick, come in and restore order. This became, Roosevelt based this off an old African proverb: speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. Your actions, your stick, is much more powerful than your words. Here's a political cartoon that depicts this big stick idea. You see Teddy Roosevelt. Again, remember that international police force. He's wearing a constable's uniform. He has his big stick, the diplomacy. He has people arguing, and he is coming in. He is intervening, and he is going to be the police officer for Latin America. The last two presidents I quickly want to talk about are William Taft, the famous president for getting stuck in the bathtub because he was so fat. He believed, so we go from Roosevelt, which is big stick diplomacy, to Taft, which is dollar diplomacy. He used the government to guarantee loans made to foreign countries by American business people. So he would pump money in order to support these countries and gain their trust. So he would give them money or loans, not just it would be in the form of a loan. Woodrow Wilson would use what is known as moral diplomacy. He believed that the U.S. had a moral responsibility to deny recognition to any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to U.S. interest.